Welcome to this episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host, Olga Peters, and I have on the show with me regular contributor Emilie Kornheiser. Hey, Emilie.
Good morning, Olga.
And also Emilie Magus Russell, who is a Brattleboro resident, a mother, a therapist, an activist, and a dancer, which I just love that combination. For folks who don't know her, she is a licensed clinical social worker and current operator of With Great Heart, which is a psychotherapy and consulting practice you can find at wgreatheart.com. Sorry, I stumbled on that. And she specializes in somatic-based trauma therapy and explorations of gender and sexuality. Emilie Magus Russell, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
And I want to quickly start this show with a quick applause because it is Emilie Magus Russell, who we'll be calling EMR for the purpose of this show, it's her birthday. So I want everyone to applaud Emilie for her birthday. Yay, happy birthday. Thank you for spending your morning with us.
Yes, happy to.
So the reason we have EMR on the show today is because it is 2020. And we are in a pandemic, and next week is a general presidential election, and everybody is feeling feels, and everyone is bringing into 2020 all the emotions and the stress and the experiences that existed before 2020 and have not gone away despite the fact it is 2020. So we just wanted to dive in with EMR and kind of talk about what is happening right now and how people are feeling, and if she has any thoughts on sort of how to weather some of these emotional storms. So again, EMR, thank you for being there. Just to start off with that, what are, as someone who holds space for people in times like this, what are you kind of feeling and experiencing in this moment?
It's a great question. Thank you. I'm definitely, experiencing, I think, similarly what everybody else is experiencing, which in a lot of ways feels like a real roller coaster of emotions. I feel like for me, this year has been one of, more than any other year in my life, to some degree, especially with the collective energy, one of really sitting with the unknown, which is not something I really love to do. It's not really, it's not a super comfortable place for my nervous system or my psyche to be. And so I feel like there has been a lot of grief for me this year. And one of the things that I think is really important is that people have gone through a lot of loss, and loss is, I think, a defining feature of this year. And a normal response to loss is grief. There's obviously large and unprecedented loss of life due to this pandemic, and people have lost a lot. And we have a habit in this culture of bringing hierarchical thinking into emotions, and yet I think it's really important and helpful to leave the sort of hierarchical thinking and the either or comparing mind outside of the emotional realm and recognize that a loss is a loss is a loss. And, I think because of the bigness of this loss energy this year, I think I've been really focusing on making really deep contact with myself. And I can say more about that as well as we talk. But so grief has been a major energy and a major emotion that I've been navigating this year. And I think a lot about grief and gratitude as two sides of the same practice. And so for me, gratitude is sort of a response to grief.
Thank you, EMR. Emilie, you want to jump in there?
Well, when I hear you say sort of that, the discomfort with grief for you, and I think for many of us, myself certainly, the major energy that I felt from people this year is certainly not grief. It's this frantic posture, which I think is indicative of that discomfort that we're all feeling, whether that's discomfort with grief or discomfort with the unknown. Mm-hmm. And so much of my time is spent navigating other people's frantic energy as well as my own through this time, through a time where we have to make so many decisions and so many new decisions. And so that's what I'm sort of reflecting on, is what happens when we make all these decisions, which we've been making this year, whether that's about, huge economic decisions or the small decisions about whether or not it's safe to go somewhere. What happens when we make those decisions from a place of that frantic avoidance posture, which might come from, any of those things that you talked about.
Yeah, and as you're speaking, I think also about one of the emotional qualities of this year is fear, right? Being in the face of the unknown, the natural reaction is fear. Any animal, any human naturally would have a fear reaction, and I think fear is has a very potent energetic quality, right? And emotions are contagious. Energy is contagious. I think as over the years as a psychotherapist, I've become more and more convinced that to some degree everybody is an emotionally sensitive person. We have this idea of empaths are emotionally sensitive people, and I certainly think there's degrees of sensitivity, and we all have this like sixth sense, if you will, to varying degrees. And I think that things really catch fire. And I think fear in the face of the unknown really caught fire this year, understandably. I don't think there could have been any other reasonable reaction for us to have had. So facing fear in the unknown, we are a culture that really highly values and preaches right and wrong, and when you step into the field of the unknown, there's just no map yet. There's no one has come before and said, this is the right way, this is the wrong way. And that framework is problematic and needs to be dismantled anyways, right? But what is the scaffolding that we have underneath that?
Mm-hmm. I think what I'm the thread I'm kind of catching here so far from you, EMR, is that sense of nature and nurture, that our emotions are what they are, and they're ours and they're personal, and yet we're trying to come at them in a framework of culture. Mm-hmm. That every culture has its strengths and its weaknesses, but regardless of what your culture's strengths and weaknesses are, if your emotions are feeling in different from that, or they're bumping up against what you believe, that can just be a whole other storm. And I find that interesting in general, but I find it interesting in a year where so much is being dismantled.
Yeah.
And so I don't quite know where I'm going with that, but it's just kind of what I'm sitting with right now.
Mm-hmm. I think that there's emotion, which appears to be a naturally occurring energy of some kind, where it comes from and you know, what triggers it is so spontaneous and really present, whatever, you know, the present moment sort of congregation of experience is that's bringing the person to that moment. And including their internal and external world, right? It's in a lot of ways, it's a mystery, you know. And there's, yes, I think culture and also conditioning, right? And I think that conditioning happens on the cultural level. It also happens on the community level. It also happens on the family level, right? And it happens first in the family level. Family is the first institution. And so I think that, you know, the way that we learn, there's the experience of having emotions, and then there's the quality of how we treat ourselves when we have an emotion, right? And I think that the way we learn to treat ourselves when we're having emotions, especially difficult emotions like grief and fear, but you know, I had a sort of bonfire side conversation this summer with some friends about how sort of childlike ecstasy or childlike joy, like unfettered, just full on excitement, like my child had when she saw the snow this morning. If adults were to act like that at gatherings, right, like it would be as sort of shamed in a lot of ways as you know, the difficult emotions are, right? So intense emotion, you know, the way we learn how to treat ourselves when we are experiencing those emotions very often happens very early in our lives. And it really is a safety survival issue, you know, and here we are facing safety and survival issues. And so we're going to use the strategies that we learn early on, and that were reinforced in, you know, the systems that we've interacted with since, to treat our emotions in such a way that helps us get along and belong with others. It's actually a very noble cause, you know, to really get along and belong. And, you know, my question for like our culture is like, what scaffolding now are we going to build as we start to dismantle some of those strategies like repression? You know, how are we going to allow this opportunity, frankly, to help us learn how to treat ourselves and each other differently?
I think it's, you know, what you're saying about how we learn how we treat ourselves and how sort of generational the scale of shifting that can be, is particularly complex in a time of such rapid change and such rapid peeling away, or widening the chasm, or seeing the truth, or however, you know, the portal that the pandemic is, however we want to describe this moment. But as more of us become more aware of the present reality and the starkness of it, it becomes even more clear that the scaffolding that we have, or the ways that we have of treating our emotions, are not suited to this moment. But it takes a long time to build that new scaffolding for ourselves, or to learn new ways of treating ourselves. The scale, it's almost as if the sort of time frames and the time scales are misaligned right now, where we have, you know, evolution, which happens slowly, whereas progress happens very quick, feels to be happening very quickly right now. And one thing that's been really helpful for me through this time is to remember history, is to remember that each of these moments is actually just part of a much larger history, that, you know, humanity has survived pandemics before, and pandemics don't just take a year, they take many years. We have survived autocracies before, we have survived genocide before. And all of those things are made up of small moments of people learning new ways of being together.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that there's history, there's the fact that it's happened before, and then there's a widening lens. It's happening now all over the world, right? And fear in the face of election outcome has been a political reality for many, many countries around the world, for a long time, right? And so I think that to some degree, our American exceptionalism, especially our white American exceptionalism, is being challenged right now, which is really a good thing because it's a deeply narrow lens and it's causing a lot of harm, and it's going to feel really hard to let it go, as a I almost said young white American. I'm going to still identify as a young white American.
Here in Windham County, you're young.
Yeah. And a person committed to racial justice work, and a person, committed to understanding the mysteries of the mind and body, and committed to intergenerational trauma healing and racial trauma healing. It's deeply physically uncomfortable for me to, make the choice at times to step outside of my young white American exceptionalism lens, and yet it's also really liberating and it's really connecting, because this experience that we are going through, while it might be new or the first time for some of us, generationally in this time and place, it is on no level new to the human experience, right? And that's, I think what you were saying, Emily, I really deeply resonate with that. And I think when we realize that, we really realize it in our bodies, our ancestors went through these things, that we actually access more resource.
One thing I've been sitting with this year, and folks who watch this show have heard me say this, that outside of my journalism life, I also practice feng shui, which is a branch of Chinese medicine, actually. And it's about, creating a harmonious environment. But as part of that, this in Chinese astrology is Year of the Rat, which is the start of a brand new 12-year cycle. And one thing these cycles ask people in the big picture, in the big kind of global energy of that year is, what will and will not come with you into the next 12 years. Mm-hmm. And that has given me comfort in a way in this upheaval, because I expect that things are going to need to wither, mm-hmm. that no longer serve us. Mm-hmm. And sometimes part of our pain is caused by how hard we're trying to hold on to what's withering.
Absolutely.
But it also, I really appreciate what you said, Emily, about grief and gratitude, because that just because something needs to wither doesn't mean that we don't miss it. But, okay, hold on the thread. Mind going. I think the other thing I'm holding on to is, as I'm watching some of the upheaval and as you said, building new scaffolding, part of me is also like, well, how much is new in this time, and how much is what we need to bring back into alignment? So, like when you were talking about American exceptionalism, America as a culture or as a dream, as an experiment, set forward some big goals, which I consider original intentions. Like they said, all men, but all people are created equal. And this idea of freedom. And so I look at the parts of our culture that have not lived up to that, mm-hmm. oppression, racism, genocide of Indigenous people, as being out of alignment with that intention and that goal. Mm-hmm. And so part of my gratitude for this year is the things that are bringing it's almost like a chiropractic adjustment, mm-hmm. bringing the spine of our culture back into, that original intention.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's maybe getting too philosophical, which maybe is not possible. So pretend I didn't say that. But I mean, you could say, and I'm going to say that perhaps nothing is actually new, right? There's mm-hmm. just, more and more is revealed. And more of these things have been available to us, but perhaps not available to young white people, or not available to Americans, or not available to people living under, last stage capitalism or whatever it is. And so it's that we're sort of pulling away, clawing away, like growing from seeds, these things that feel new because they're new to us in this moment, in this generation, in this body. But there are pieces of them, other places that can be familiar if we go looking for them. And I think that really helps with this challenge of feeling gratitude for something that's uncomfortable and difficult and hurts and is connected to grief and all of that. Like this idea that we should feel grateful for what we're leaving behind and bringing forth is really hard and really uncomfortable and fairly terrible. And, that dissonance between our desires and our discomfort, I think, is really at the heart of so much of what is difficult politically and socially in this pandemic.
Yeah, and I think it's, go ahead.
Should we go to break?
No, we still have 5 minutes.
Oh my God, I'm sorry for not trusting you in your timer.
My fancy timer that actually shows.
Oh, I forgot that you had the new timer. I can totally release myself from worrying about this now. Excuse me. Okay.
Olga's not very good with time.
Forevermore, I am going to trust in the new timer. Emilie, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I mean, so many threads there. I think that, it's possible to hold multiple realities at the same time. And I think that is something that we are really being challenged to grow in our capabilities of doing. The degree of duality in the form of binary that this culture is committed to, is really grasped onto, is, I think, naturally, sort of physically going to bring a polarity and going to bring conflict and tension, and when, what I think of with what you were saying, Emilie, is that the fear of letting go of a grasp on something. You said that, Olga, and I think that's wonderful. I think about that and I practice that in my body a lot. And it's really scary because you don't know where you're going to live. It's completely disorienting. We are oriented to life being a certain way in this culture. And for many of us, that might be just 10 years that we've been here, 20 years that we've been here, 30 years that we've been here, 40 years, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 years we've been here. And, some of us may have more access to, intergenerational communication, or, are more interested in history and so know a little bit more about it than others. But it's important to also sort of honor the scale of your life, and that this is the first time that you've maybe had to, not be able to travel, or that you've, really been restricted in the way that we are, or that you've feared, death due to a virus, like really, this might be the first time. And a lot of that shows the advances that we have made as in science, and, in being able to prolong life and protect ourselves from certain forms of death. And as we are supporting ourselves or each other in those reactions to those parts of our truth, how do we help people access other sort of information, resources, perspectives to build something bigger than just this moment that we're in, or just this lifetime that we're living, frankly. And it's learning, right? Like, and as a society, we're young and we have a lot to learn, and I think one of the most important things about the movement for Black Lives and Black Lives Matter, and movements to center and uplift the voices of Black, Brown, and Indigenous people, and all people of color, queer and trans people otherwise marginalized. I think that we have somehow forgot that we have so much to learn from people who have been able to overcome so much resistance and so much genocide and so much loss and grief and oppression and harm. And
can I jump
yeah,
in for
go
a
ahead.
second there? So, you know, the language around resiliency has been a very popular one in sort of the place where politics and social work meet. For the last, say, 5 years, money has been poured into resiliency, you know, but it's always been about individual resiliency. And what I hear you describing is that we have entire cultures and classes and groups of people with an experience of true resiliency, historic resiliency,
Right.
that we have
Right.
so much to learn from. And when we conduct, say, trainings, especially in sort of social action groups, when we conduct trainings to learn a particular skill, we often talk about these sort of circles of learning, right? There's, I'm trying to make this conversation a little more tangible for a moment. We talk about, there's like the red and the yellow and the green. And the green is where you're comfortable and you're not really learning. And the red is where you're in sort of fight, flight, freeze, and you can't learn either because you're freaking out. And the yellow is where the learning happens and it's uncomfortable. And if I think about this year for our community and for our culture, we have all just been like hanging out so hard in the yellow. And it takes tremendous energy to like even hang out in the green because that's just not what the world is right now. And it takes tremendous energy to stay out of the red and to be like constantly moving between the red and the yellow.
Unfortunately, now that the timer has ticked its last tick for this section, we need to go to break and hear from some of our underwriters. But the Montpelier Happy Hour with Emilie Kornheiser and Emily Magus Russell on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro will return in a moment. Before you do that, welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. You can also find us on Brattleboro Community Television, BCTV, as well as Emilie Kornheiser's YouTube channel. I'm your host, Olga Peters, and you are just joining us. I am speaking today with regular contributor Emilie Kornheiser, as well as therapist, mom, dancer, and activist Emily Magus Russell. Thank you for being with us today, both of you.
Thank you.
Emilie Kornheiser, you were talking so beautifully about resilience, before the break. And I want to shift, however, to the upcoming elections that are happening next week and many of the emotions that people are experiencing around them. I was talking with friends last night over dinner, and I thought they summed it up so well. They said, everyone's making their predictions. Everybody has their hopes. And yet after 2016, where so many people were just absolutely amazed at the outcome, positive or negative, amazed, that a lot of people just are not trusting their instincts about how, Tuesday can play out. So I want to throw that to you, Emily Magus Russell, as well as Emilie Kornheiser, and just kind of touch base. Again, we're in that uncertainty zone.
Yeah, this is a tough one. And, I think that what I have been thinking a lot about and talking with folks about is the quality of our nervous system right now, as individuals and as a collective, right? And so we spent the first half of this conversation talking about like the unknowns related to the pandemic, and we're going into another wave, right, of increased pandemic COVID rates, and at that same time we're dealing with a really frightening election season. and a Supreme Court confirmation that a lot of people have a lot of feelings about. And so, you know, for me, it's sort of like Emilie, you were talking about the sort of frantic energy that you've been experiencing from others at this time.
And myself, I don't want to act
and
like
yourself,
other
yeah,
people.
totally. Yeah, totally. And there's like this kind of uptick. And I just, you know, I think a lot about our nervous systems and the adrenaline and the like sympathetic nervous system response that people's bodies are in right now. You know, if we were at risk of, you know, if it was a predator that we were concerned about, right? If there was a saber-toothed tiger running after us, yes, your sympathetic nervous system stays active for a pretty long time until you're able to outrun or hide from or somehow find safety from that tiger. And then when the threat of that that tiger goes away, your parasympathetic nervous system pops in and makes sure that you get rest and that you eat and that you refuel and that you recover from the prolonged state. I don't know that we're getting really much recovery from these threats. And so, you know, it is really continues to be this facing of the unknown that for me brings up, okay, there's questions about the outcome, like what's going to happen. And we are very sort of heady culture. We like to really talk about what that is or is going to be. And how are our bodies feeling? I mean, we have to create our own opportunities for parasympathetic nervous system response. And it's hard to do. And it's really harder for some people than others for a variety of reasons. And some of us have more privilege to be able to create that. The fact that I have a house to live in makes it infinitely more possible for me to regulate my nervous system than somebody who doesn't have a house to live in, you know? So there's so many factors here. And yeah, I think all the dialogue, all the news, all of the information gathering, I can understand why that's really important to many people. And I just really hope that people are also finding ways to take care of their bodies and be in the present moment with their bodies and their families and themselves, even during the midst of this like super heightened state. And there's gonna, you know, we're gonna be, for weeks, folks have been in this state around the election. It's not gonna let down until, you know, well, like days after the actual election. So just remember, your body is in some kind of fight, flight, freeze state for some time now.
I keep on saying to people that I can't wait for next Friday. And everyone's like, what do you mean? Don't you mean next Wednesday? I'm like, no, I want next Friday, because I know that the days between Tuesday and Friday are going to be filled with both a need for rest and like franticness about what's going to come next. But I know by next Friday, at least we'll be in a new phase of something, and I'll be able to feel that in my body. When what you said about sort of the information gathering and the constant information gathering, and Olga, what you said about not being able, people having the sense that they can't trust in their instincts around the election. I think it's so, one of the challenges with sort of our nervous systems and living in modernity is how vast the amount of information is. And given the state of, you know, private sector ownership of media and corporate ownership of media, it's so hard to remember that we really only know ourselves and barely our own social circles. And so the bubbles that we each live in, you know, socially, even within our community, let alone within our town or our state, or how Vermont actually fits into the rest of the country, is essentially, you know, mostly impenetrable without enormous amounts of effort. And so I'm constantly struck by how real each of our experiences are about what truth is, what's right, you know, in this very dichotomous right and wrong, what's right for this country, what people need next, what people other than ourselves need for things to go well. And people make, you know, all of that stuff gets wrapped up into the kinds of election decisions we make. One, people generally vote just straight from their nervous system, even though we all pretend we don't. You need to like your candidate, right? That's the most important thing for people, even though that has very little to do with the way that person's going to govern. And then there's the third piece that I think is really hard for us to get our heads around. There's so much cognitive dissonance with the story that we have of democracy for white people, with the story we have of democracy and how it works. And then the really rampant and intense voter suppression that happens all over this country, and how disenfranchised, and even without voter suppression, how disenfranchised so many voters are. And so we're not actually talking about how the entire country votes. We're talking about how a fairly small segment of the country votes, and a privileged segment of that country. And so like trying to get all those three things into like the truth box of our minds and know what's going to happen is not possible. Like computer simulations can't do it. I don't know why we would think that somehow if we watch the news enough and like doom scroll through Twitter enough, we'll be able to find the truth. It's not, it's, again, we have to actually just sit in the unknown.
Yeah.
And that's impossible.
And, you know, I think, I know this is a bit controversial to say, but I think on one level, you know, national politics for me is a sort of shared illusion. And also it has very serious consequences, very real consequences, right? Just like the concept of race is a construct that was created for a very specific purpose of gaining land and protecting and gaining land and resources for white wealthy people, and to take attention away from class divide. And it has had very real consequences on people's lives. And so there again is stepping outside that duality and recognizing, how do I relate to this thing that has very real impact on people's lives? And also, I can't quite grasp it because on some level, it's not really quite real, you know, or if to the degree to which it's real, I have very limited access to it, right? And I think it's really difficult for a nervous system then to attune to where, you know, what makes sense or what truth is, when it's not quite true that it's not real, right? It's clearly, I'm seeing something and I'm going to go vote, or I might choose not to vote, or I'm not even going to be able to vote. And then there's going to be some new actions that are going to impact a lot of people, and some people more than others. Yet it's not, you know, it's also not super true that my vote matters, you know, like it's not super true. I can't quite, you know, so I think one of the things that I want for folks is that we are unburdening. You talked a little bit about guilt, Olga, offline when we were chatting a bit. And guilt is an overtaking of responsibility. It's a stuck energy. It's a stuck energy in our body where we maybe can't face our reality because it's too overwhelming, right? Or we're actually so deeply sensitive to our reality that we are overconsumed by it and taking too much responsibility for it. And what I want for folks is to unburden from the overtaking of personal responsibility for these things that are vast and have a huge legacy, a huge history. And we are one speck of dust and on a speck of dust, in a speck of dust, you know, in that lens. But we have to unburden from that crushing sense of personal responsibility so that we can actually unfreeze our nervous system and engage in the world.
When we think about, so there's that incredible unburdening so we can engage. And I think when we exist in sort of the usual colonialist duality, we say, okay, so I have no control, there's nothing I can do. Whereas I think the option that's available to us, if we can find our way to it, is something that Adrienne Marie Brown describes in Emergent Strategies. It's something that Rebecca Solnit talks a lot about in the Hope in the Dark. Is that the name of the book? I think that's the name of the book. Rebecca Solnit talks a lot about is the idea that just because we can't see the entire whole or the future or create, the most comprehensive strategic plan doesn't mean that our emotions today don't create the next wave from our moment. Right. And so we do what we can towards shaping that future. It doesn't mean we're powerless towards the future. It means we can't control the future. And those are two very different things, being powerless and being unable to control, and being able to sit between those two things and say, I can't control the election, but I will help encourage people to vote. I will write postcards. I will talk to my neighbor. I will go to the ballot box. I will make sure that even if the leader that I want on the ballot today isn't there, I'm going to spend my time focusing on making sure that the leaders of tomorrow have the resources that they need to show up. And so being, again, a place where we need to be able to sit outside of the duality and say we can't control, we're releasing ourselves from that control and that guilt that paralyzes us. So, and instead sort of stepping into the emergence of I'm going to do what I can today towards that future that will come tomorrow.
And, cognitive reframing, which is a strategy where you frankly change your mind. you identify the way you're thinking, and you intentionally think differently. You take on a different perspective and sort of do the sort of mental gymnastics or the stretching, the legwork that it takes to sort of shift your perspective, right? It's critical. It's very important. It's very helpful, and it's still a cognitive, heady process, right? Like if we want to deal with our guilt, we have to go into the body. The emotions and energy live in the body, right? The mind, it's a lot of effort, and it has, with some minimal positive impact, the mind can shift some of that, but we have to engage the body, and guilt is a freeze response that underneath it is all the emotion, grief about what this whole world, the guilt of white privilege paralyzes white folks from being able to tolerate and endure the work of dismantling white supremacy, right? I don't get through one day, not one day, without facing my white supremacy. It's everywhere. It's the water I swim in, it's the air I breathe, right? I'm now in the practice of saying things, and I'm saying, I'm going to try not to say that again, as I'm saying it. I mean, our language is deeply infused with it. Our thoughts are deeply infused with it, the way we treat our bodies, and our emotions are deeply infused with it, the way we treat each other. And so that takes a lot of endurance, right? To take a breath, to pause and say, I'm going to try that differently, right? And so I think the work of unfreezing that guilt and that shame is really body-based work. And I think activating the breath and activating the body and activating what the body can do, right? Every body can do something, right? And every body is a good body. And having a relationship with your body that is one of gratitude, right? That in itself takes a lifetime for many people, because we've really done a number on this concept, right? And so I know, we're talking about elections. We like to talk about it. We like to get heady about it. I think when we're noticing the paralysis in our body, sometimes the mind likes to take over. That's fine. And what are some strategies that folks can use to pause, pause the dinner table conversation, pause the news article reading, pause and really take a deep breath and recognize that the only real option you have, you're saying power, like the only way for someone not to feel powerless is for someone to feel their own power, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that has been blocked and taken from people for a long time, especially people of color, especially queer folks, and trans folks, especially women, right? And so how do we sort of take a moment in this larger moment to really like reconnect with ourselves and our sense of power? And I think a lot of it has to do with permission. When there's so much attention on the external world, when there's so much that's demanding our attention, where are we sourcing permission from? Where are we sourcing the permission to take a breath, to set a boundary with yourself, right? To say, I'm not going to look at my phone again tonight because I'm going to focus on X, Y, Z. Or, can we shift the conversation? I'm noticing that I'm getting really frozen, How do we take breaks now, the day of the election, the day after our minds can really convince us that we're not worthy of that. And that's part of our conditioning. But how do we sort of dismantle that and show up for our bodies in that way?
EMR, if you don't mind, I realize I'm putting you on the spot here. I think what you just said about taking that pause is so crucial, because that pause is actually a transition point or a threshold. And if you can step over the threshold, you can inch by inch step into new worlds.
Right.
So do you have a practice or a short breathing exercise that people can actually do to hit that pause and give it some substance?
Sure. Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts. One or practices really. One is a grounding practice and one is a grief and gratitude practice. So maybe what I can do is we can do them together. Maybe the three of us can do them right now and listeners can do them as well. And I'll do each one for 30 seconds. So it won't take very long.
I'm good with that. Are you, Emilie?
I'm so excited. Thank you.
Let's go.
So the first practice is really about grounding. So what we can do is take a moment to shift your position in your body so that you're in a little bit more deeper contact with yourself. We tend to live from the outside of ourselves. When our nervous systems are activated, there's a real forward movement to it. So reconnect inside of yourself. And
perfect.
Reconnect inside of yourself, and you can close your eyes or keep them open for this. We're just going to touch something. So if you're sitting at a desk, you can touch the desk. If you're sitting on a chair or couch, you can touch that chair or couch. If you're driving, you can touch the steering wheel, and also make sure you're staying attending to the road. And find your breath and feel the object that you're touching at the same time. And see if, even if just for a moment, your full attention can be there. And it's not split between the breath and the object. It's really attuning to both at the same time. And see if you can let your body settle into your hand's connection to the object that you're touching, as if you're living there, or sitting there at that connection between your hand and the desk, the object. Bringing yourself down into that connection. And that's a nice practice that you can do anywhere, anytime. Whether you're talking to someone or not, you can do it. It's not too socially awkward. And then the next practice that I want to offer is a breath practice. And go ahead and just find a nice, steady, even breath, equal inhale and exhale. And on the inhale, allow yourself to feel the grief of this moment. It might be a brief pause between inhale and exhale. You can hold that grief. And on the exhale, release it as gratitude. On the inhale, breathe in the grief of this moment and every moment that has happened before now. Hold in reverence for just a moment, and then release your breath in gratitude for this moment and every moment that's to come. And again, inhale. See if you can breathe that inhale into the heart. This is the work of awakening and strengthening the heart. So inhale, breathe in that grief. Grief work expands the heart. And exhale to release it. Release gratitude. So when you find your nervous system frozen, when you find yourself in guilt or paralyzed with your privilege, then this can be a nice practice to get things moving again.
EMR, thank you for that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I so appreciate how tactile both those practices can be, because we can get very heady and geeky on this show even.
Me too.
We have just under 5 minutes left, so I just want to touch base and see if either of you want to leave listeners with any thoughts before we wrap up.
My final thought that I really do want to say is, I do think one of the opportunities of this time is to make better friends with yourself. It's a time of isolation. It's a time of quietness. It's a time of unknown. And so you have your feelings, and then just notice how I'm really working on noticing how I treat myself in those feelings. And when my external relationships are on a little bit more pause than usual because of the pandemic, there's a myriad of selves that I have access to that I can focus on relationship building.
Thank you, Emilie. Emilie Kornheiser, any last minute thoughts or feelings?
I think my feeling right now, which is half a feeling and half a thought, is that whatever happens on Tuesday, we're all still gonna be here together. And we need to remember that, and remember that we have each other. We have ourselves as resources, and we have each other as resources. Whether that means that we're still in the unknown, which we always will be, or whether that means that, you know, we have whatever president we have next, we're gonna need to push back. It'll just take a different form. And so I'm glad that we have each other through that.
Thank you. I am my last suggestion is coming straight from my journalist life. As much as I am a journalist and I love journalism and feel it's very necessary in this time, I am not a fan of the 24-hour news cycle. I feel that you should read your news and then process it before you take into new information. So give yourself permission not to be in the know every single minute of the day, and give yourself permission to process that information and feel it and respond to it before you take in new information. As we head out, Emilie, do you have a toast for our listeners?
I would like to toast to Emily Megas Russell and her very happy birthday, and with gratitude for you spending this time on your birthday morning with us.
Thank you.
Hear, hear. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for having me so much.
Yes, I hope you can come back at some point too.
Yeah,
this was really wonderful.
Great.
The Montpelier Happy Hour on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. You can catch us at 2 p.m. on Friday on the radio. You can also catch us at BCTV and Emilie's YouTube channel. Emilie, if people need to find you, can they reach out?
Folks can find me on emiliekornheiser.org, where you have access to my Facebook, my Twitter, my Instagram, my email address, my phone number, my physical address, but please don't come without calling first. And every Saturday morning, I host a community coffee hour conversation via Zoom that you can find the login information for on any of those other platforms I listed.
Fantastic. Emilie Megas Russell, your website quickly?
wgreatheart.com.
Fantastic. Everyone have a good weekend. We will catch you
Thanks.
next week. Thank you.
Bye.